Hey guys, it's about time that I give an actual list on this channel. A full top 10 list, a more well thought out, no nonsense list of games. So how about those games that don't have a whole lot to offer in terms of graphics?
My face is tired from dealing with everything.
Now don't worry, I won't be judging them for their artistic value since that's nearly impossible with how subjective this is. Instead, I'll be going over my top 10 games that simply don't have the hallmarks of a beautiful game with intense, modern graphical effects. No cutting corners, I'll try not to mention any games that pushed graphics even for when they came out. So no Final Fantasy VII or Ocarina of Time or anything like that for this list. It's the point of seeing how we can make mechanics work in both a 2D space and a 3D space without all the pretty polygons to back them up. Now with all that out of the way, let's look at some of the best gameplay experiences with my personal picks, in no particular order, for my top 10 best games with bad graphics of all time. The pretty much guaranteed way to not have any pretty polygons is to go back in a time where polygons weren't even a thing in gaming. And no, not NES and SNES era. Believe it or not, those had games with polygons. Instead, we're going old school, to a time where your dad might even have a hard time remembering. Now, because we're going so far back, nearly every game qualifies, so I guess I'm sort of cheating. But hey, if any game's gameplay mechanics hold up well after over 30 years, then I think I've done my job, to be perfectly honest. So we've got the simple yet fun Alien Invaders, the cool and surprisingly mechanic-heavy Alpine Skiing, the classic, although not nearly as good as its future installments in my opinion, Frogger. We've also got some pretty addictive titles like Killer Bees, Casey's Crazy Chase, and Invaders from Hyperspace, but my favorite has got to be Attack of the Time Lord. Attack of the Time Lord is a slide and shoot game, and no, I'm not just making that up as a genre. You fight this, which is a Time Lord. And what makes him a Time Lord? I have no idea. But you have to shoot him until he whittles away into nothing. Then the next round begins even harder than the last. If you get hit by anything, you get set back to the previous round. It's fast-paced and addicting as can be, even after 35 years. In fact, its gameplay holds up so well after all these years, I would say it's likely just as good today as it was on its first release, and that's why it's gotta be my first pick on this list. After all those awesome 2D games in a couple generations, we consistently got more 3D games. Developers had to make a lot of changes to adapt to that, and some games, even today, just haven't translated that well when going to the third dimension. Next on our list are games where 3D started becoming popular. After all, that's how gaming has changed over the years in terms of both graphics and mechanics. And while most early 3D games looked pretty good for their time, some were definitely panned worse than others. Similar to how it works today, honestly. This time, however, we're looking at early 3D games that have good gameplay, even though you couldn't say the same about their graphics. And just to be clear here, I'm mostly relying on forums and reviews for what people said about the graphics, as I was too young to know, let alone care about the graphics back then. We're talking about games like Soul Reaver, the original Jet Moto, WWF SmackDown, and while Gex Enter the Gecko and Nightmare Creatures were my really close runner-ups, there's nothing quite like a good old matchup of Twisted Metal. You might also be able to include Twisted Metal 2, as that game looked pretty similar and it had some further improved gameplay, but I'll be discussing the original due to its less varied tracks. Honestly, I'm stuck here not knowing what to say. What hasn't been said about Twisted Metal already? It's fun, exciting, iconic, unique, and incredibly recognizable. It is guns, fast-paced, and just pure ecstasy. But you already know that, don't you? Whether you're playing alone or with a friend, this is a game that you should not be missing out on if you haven't already played it. The last two entries were sorted by timeline, but let's start looking at genres here for a second. After all, there are certain things you would expect when looking at a specific genre, whether that be racing games, RPGs, shooters, you name it. While we expect variety, we also expect a certain standard to be met within each of these genres. One of the best mechanically sound genres, however, has got to be the fighting game. With the complete need for tight controls and reasonably balanced gameplay offerings, these games have to make sure they play extremely well if they want to compete against other fighting games. And while most games also have satisfactory graphics to back that up, one great game that still sticks out like a sore thumb is Injustice: Gods Among Us.
You're Luther's pet now, Deathstroke?
His money's green, and as a bonus, I get to kill Batman.
Alright, I've got to admit here, Injustice doesn't really look that bad. It's just that I couldn't actually find many good fighting games that were criticized for their graphics in the first place, and most of the games that I found with bad graphics just weren't considered to be very good in the first place. Still, Injustice: Gods Among Us doesn't always look like sunshines and rainbows. Its cutscenes especially look surprisingly poor for being the end of the 7th generation. Even with the arguably lackluster graphics, however, there's a reason why it became the highest-selling game in the US and UK during the month of its release. It received a bunch of awards, and when you consider the fact that this is a new IP, that seems pretty darn impressive. There's good reasoning for it too. Developed by the studio that made the more recent Mortal Kombat games, its praise was mainly pointed towards, of course, the gameplay. Whether that be for its controls, tight response and tuning, or its unique fighting mechanics, this was a fighter that was truly astounding and seemed to dominate in 2013. As great as fighters can be, let's take a step back for a second from the intense, fast-paced nature of that closed-in, more linear genre, and look at one that's significantly more expansive. RPGs are filled with huge landscapes and sometimes incredible amounts of exploration, so oftentimes they've got pretty good graphics. Still, RPGs aren't just expansive in terms of environments, but also gameplay. In fact, I would say that most RPGs have more complex gameplay than most other genres to begin with. So there are definitely some good games to be had, even if their graphics weren't very good for their time. In fact, some all-time classics come to mind like Deus Ex, Dragon Age Origins, and Persona 4, but I think the most appropriate choice, for me at least, would have to be Fallout 3. Fallout 3 was Todd Howard's first truly directed game that became a breakout success, and rightly so. While most forms of its gameplay have existed in other games, outside of maybe its VATS targeting system, what Fallout does so well is how it tackles the complexity of its gameplay. There's the hugely explorable world, the impact you have in the story through interactable dialogue, the leveling system, the different skills of gameplay for your characters such as lockpicking, hacking, stealing, or doing pretty much anything you want, really. And that's not even mentioning the vast amount of options that you have regarding weaponry either. Fallout 3 is a massive world that gives you a ton of potentially complex stuff you could do, far more than most other games, even RPGs for its time, and lets you choose what you want to do throughout the entire game.
Because in Vault 101, no one ever enters, and no one ever leaves.
I want to assign every available band to finding Ethan Mars.
Fallout 3 sort of proves that there are so many different types of games out there, all with their own interesting forms of gameplay. However, one thing I haven't mentioned much is regarding story.
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
While story is, for the most part, non-interactive, there are definitely games out there that give you a gameplay experience with the story. While most of these are pretty good looking for their time, there are a few out there with more modest graphics. Maybe the original Mass Effect, pretty much any Telltale game, and probably even the aforementioned Fallout 3. However, for me personally, the one with the most satisfying story and gameplay mix of these has to be The Wolf Among Us. This excellently performed adventure may look cartoony if you're not familiar with most games by Telltale, or if you are familiar with them but only by their earlier games. You're probably expecting this to be more on the silly side of things. Well, while this game does have a good sense of humor in my opinion, it, more importantly, has a fantastic and dark story to precede the Fables comics. Not only that, but its gameplay interactivity is pretty strong, even if on the easier side of things. But hey, that's sort of expected with a modern Telltale game. And with that, I cannot wait for the second season that was recently confirmed. I'm going to be slightly bold here real quick and say that I actually prefer The Wolf Among Us over the Walking Dead Telltale series, if that says anything about it.
The guy's got an axe in his brain. He's not feeling that.
In almost complete contrast to my number 6 pick, this slot is going to be more about the games where you, the player, make the gameplay and story. Well, at least as much as you can while it being a game. While there are a bunch of games that have little to no scripted story and gameplay and lets you make that up, I think that the biggest pleasure of a game, with the biggest displeasure of the eyes, would have to be Minecraft. There are actually quite a few good contenders for this pick. I was honestly going to go for Animal Crossing first, actually, but its graphics aren't that bad for its time, and I think it's agreeable to say that it actually has somewhat of a story. Minecraft, on the other hand, has mining and crafting. It's an immersive experience where you work towards your own goals and not one predisposed by the developer for you to achieve. This game became huge, and I think there's a pretty good reason why. You work hard, you get stuff. You work hard, you make stuff. You live in your area or go out exploring and reap the benefits of constantly working to keep getting rewarded. It's like a formula for fun that you can create yourself, and that's why it's my number 5 pick. Let's take another step back for a second from these more specific genres and go back to time frames real quick. After all, I haven't even gone over one of my favorite generations, if not my favorite, the 6th generation. This is PS2, Xbox, GameCube, Dreamcast era gaming. It was still before a lot of the AAA games started becoming more cinematic, but still long enough into the 3D era where we started to see true refinement in gameplay. Of course, this isn't always true. But generally speaking, there's more refinement and good gameplay to be shown, and that's why I'm going to go with Dynasty Warriors 3. While not particularly well known for its good voice acting,
Feel the power of my magic!
this game doesn't really need that, and it doesn't need good story or good graphics. At the end of the day, this game series has sequel after sequel after sequel and pretty much always sells reasonably well. While the gameplay itself may be repetitive and easy, that's part of the reason why I chose this for number 4. It's got some seriously refined and well put together gameplay if we're willing to deal with that excessive amount of repetition. And that's why I'm going with this for number 4.
A dike? Oh no!
I've gone over many different points in time on this list, but one that I still haven't really covered is the one we're currently in, the 8th generation. A generation that often mixes story with gameplay a bit more than most other generations. While some games fail at this, others take that opportunity to rise and shine above the repetitive sequels and deliver on something awesome. And I think a game that's done that best is Wolfenstein: The New Order. While I actually like Wolfenstein's graphics, reviewers didn't. But what they, and I, did like were the combat mechanics, stealth, and for the most part, the story. What makes this Wolfenstein so special is that, while it has clear elements of the previous games, its approach to both story and gameplay is far different and welcomed. Its gameplay is like a symphony of blood, while its story, although unintrusive, is a welcome step up from most games. It's got interesting characters, good stealth mechanics, well thought out level design, well balanced enemies, fast paced action, big weapons, small weapons, and it's all awesome. With a game like this, it's no wonder there's a sequel. Putting story aside, there are some games that have more meaning beyond the gameplay. There's innovation, evolution, a clear step forward from what we're previously used to, which is why Star Fox earns a spot on this list. While I didn't really see reviewers comment on its graphics being good or bad, this is the first Nintendo-made game to effectively use polygonal graphics. It's both a good and a bad thing. The bad thing is, of course, in its graphics, but the good thing, more importantly, is in its innovative gameplay. There weren't very many games quite like Star Fox at the time of release, and it showcased just how fun takes priority over graphics and frame rate. It needed no real story or good graphics, or any padding really. It was revolutionary and fun, and is arguably the pinnacle of those two concepts combined, and that's why it takes the number 2 spot on my list. I think it's somewhat agreeable to say that one way that's sure to prove your game is sound in its gameplay mechanics is to release it in a time where AAA 3D games with beautiful graphics are basically king. An almost complete inverse to my very first pick of this list, we're looking at games that have released much more recently, simply put, in the PS3 or PS4 era. That way, if a game truly holds up and it's not graphically stunning or has tons of story, you know it's because the gameplay is that freaking good. To be clear here, I'm not talking about games like Undertale, Lisa, Five Nights at Freddy's, or Hello Neighbor. Although games like that arguably have great gameplay mechanics on their own, for this pick we're looking at games that have little to no lore to retreat back to ensure the quality of its gameplay mechanics. Examples include This War of Mine, Super Hexagon, Worms, Contrast maybe, but it does have some story to it, Celeste, but my personal favorite has to be a different gem from the same developer as Celeste, called Towerfall Ascension. Developed by an incredibly talented indie developer, Matt Makes Games, Towerfall is an amazingly fun game to play by yourself, with friends, against friends, for a few minutes, for a few hours, whatever the case may be. It's got mostly simple gameplay with a few interesting mechanics, and that's it. But that's part of why it's so dang fun. You can just jump in and enjoy the game. No waiting around or having to go through long tutorials. You can learn and master the game if you want to, but the beauty of this game is just how fun it is, whether you're a complete beginner or a so-called veteran. I think this is one of the few modern games out there that really showcases the true nature of what gaming was meant to be about. No offense to any other games, of course, but this is my list, and so this is probably my personal favorite game of all time with poor graphics. With all those mentioned though, here are a few runner-ups. Wind Waker. While holding up well over time, it didn't really get very good reception when it initially released, and that includes criticism over its graphics. However, I think the root of the problem with this game was that people were hoping for a more realistic-looking Zelda game, and it ended up being judged unfairly because of that. I think the graphical criticisms were just an extension of that unfair judgment, so I didn't put it on this list because I do think it looks very good for its time. Transistor's incredibly fun, and it's got some unique gameplay, but I felt like having multiple indie games from the 8th generation would have been lacking in variety a little bit. Still, excellent game with an excellent art style and an excellently presented story. Check it out. Thomas Was Alone. This game's a really nice puzzle game. Once again though, it's another recent indie game. Robotron 2084. I had a ton of fun with this game, but I couldn't find much on what people thought of it when it came out when it comes to its graphics, so I couldn't really rightly put it on this list. Limbo. Fun, but once again, it's a recent indie game. If you like an older style of gameplay with a lot of trial and error though, this game is dark and it is fun. RuneScape. The final runner-up. I couldn't really say much about this game because I never played it much. I got to level 37 or something and stopped. I almost put it on this list though because of how incredibly popular it got and because of its graphics. But I was always more of a WoW player, and WoW, when it came out at least, did look pretty good. Alright, well that was a bunch of work, but also a bunch of fun. What do you think about these games? And more importantly, what would your list of games look like? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, have fun.